So as expected, there's been an irrational backlash against innocent Muslims since the ISIS terror attack in Paris. Let me give you a few examples of that. On Monday, vandals targeted a mosque in Texas. They threw human shit at it. They also ripped up the Quran. But believe it or not, that's, in my opinion, that's... Get over it if you don't like that. Free country, that is an expression of free speech. You should be able to rip up the Bible, rip up the Quran, piss on the American flag, whatever you want to do, that's free speech. But throwing human feces at the mosque, well, then you're actually doing property damage. And this, again, was in direct response to the Paris terror attacks. So what they're saying is, hey, random mosque in Texas, you're guilty of it, even though you had fucking nothing to do with it. Absurd. There's a mosque in Ontario, Canada, that was deliberately set on fire on Sunday evening. In Florida, several mosques received threats. Now, the FBI thankfully said they looked into it and they weren't legitimate. But nonetheless, there were calls and some direct threats of violence. In Toronto, a sign was placed near a Muslim neighborhood asking if they're sorry for the attacks. Now, let me pause on that one for a second. A lot of Muslims have come out after this attack and condemned it. Many groups, many individuals, there are multiple hashtags on Twitter about, Muslims denouncing this attack. But if you really think about it, the implication there is troublesome. The default assumption is, well, we think you agree with it unless you say otherwise. Why would that be the default assumption? I mean, for example, my mother's a Catholic. When the Catholic Church was diddling and boinking little boys, and it was an epidemic, are we just supposed to assume that she's guilty of it, or she knew about it, or she gave it her stamp of approval when that happened? No, that'd be ridiculous, right? So I don't know why it's not ridiculous also for Muslims. Now, don't get me wrong. As I've said time and time again, and I'll continue to say, and I'll continue to do, I'm going to argue against the text of the Quran and the Hadith, because I think it's irrational, I think it's untrue, and that's not bigotry, that's not, something where you need to point your finger at me and say I'm doing something wrong. No, I'm just pointing out factual inaccuracies. That's something that's totally different. But this idea that, hey, I need every Muslim in the world to come out and say I'm not with the terrorists is ridiculous, because again, it assumes that they do agree with it unless they say otherwise. Which means in your mind, you actually are generalizing about the Muslim community, and you're saying, well, I guess they do agree with it unless they say otherwise. So I don't get why they have to do that, and that, is a good example of it right here. Putting a sign by a Muslim neighborhood. Are you sorry for this? Why? They had absolutely nothing to do with it. All right, next one. A Fox contributor called for spying on all mosques in America. Stay classy, because that'll work. And to be clear, they were doing this in New York City for a while. They never got any intelligence out of it. Whereas there was an example of, I think it was a train that was going to be attacked in Canada, and people in the Muslim community in Canada went to law enforcement and said, we think that this guy's about to do something crazy. We think this guy is radical. Now, why did that happen? Because they actually had a good relationship with Muslims and with various mosques. And as a result of that, they were able to stop a terror attack. Whereas here, all they were doing was spying and treating them as the other when there was no evidence of any wrongdoing. Guys, don't get me wrong. If there's evidence that any mosque is radical, and they are preaching direct threats of violence, and they are involved in terrorism in one way or another, of course you spy on them after you get your warrant, and of course you shut them down. That's a no-brainer. But what they're saying on Fox, what's his name, Bo Dietl or some shit like that, which almost sounds like a fake name, he was like, no, let's spy on mosques, period. Not some mosques, not radical mosques, let's spy on mosques. Let's spy on all mosques. Well, then you're violating civil liberties and you're violating rights. But he actually went on to say in that segment, we need to stop worrying about people's rights. You don't believe me? I'll provide a link in the video description box and you'll see. He quite literally said that. So this is what we're dealing with here, and that's the exact wrong response that in many ways is going to give the terrorists what they want, to feed into this us versus them mentality. All right, next we have a Toronto area Muslim woman who was beaten and robbed by two men while picking up her children from school. According to police, the men told her to, quote, go back to her country, and they called her a terrorist. She had nothing to do with the attacks! Nothing to do with the attacks! If you do something like this, you are generalizing about Muslims, and you are assuming they're all guilty for the attack when they're not. Next, a Hindu temple in Ontario, Canada was vandalized Sunday night while the temple's spiritual leader was attending a nearby vigil for the victims of the Paris attacks. Look at that irony, and look at the multiple layers of stupidity. The guy is actually at a vigil for the Paris attacks, and you're attacking his place as if he's responsible for the Paris attacks, or as if he agrees with them or something. And it's not even a mosque! It's a Hindu temple! We see this all the time. In the US, they'll attack Sikhs as if they're Muslim. They're not Muslim. By the way, if they were Muslim, you still shouldn't do it because they're still innocent people you're attacking. But look at how many layers deep the stupidity goes. I don't know, they're brownish. I don't know, it's a different religion, so attack it. No, you're the problem here. You're the bigot. You're the bad guy. An Oklahoma man called 911 and said that he'd shoot, quote, anything that looks Muslim. Now, the cop showed up here and ended up shooting him. I don't think he died. None of the articles said that, at least none of the ones that I saw. And there's also questions about that guy's mental health, like he might actually have a history of being crazy. If that's the case, perhaps the cop should have, taken more precaution and been more careful and not immediately shot. But the guy literally said he's going to shoot, quote, anything that looks Muslim. They have the 911 phone call on that. Then there's a Muslim family in Orlando, Florida that had their home targeted with gunfire. And then there's an Ethiopian Christian Uber driver who was beaten up by a passenger because he was confused to be a Muslim. I'm just giving you the some of the stories that happened between the Paris attack and today. Guys, do we want to get back the people who did the terror attack? Absolutely. I did over a 20-minute segment giving exactly the policy response that I think should be done. And I hope that my ideas are intelligent and targeted at the people who actually did it and the group that's responsible for it, ISIS. So do we all have that feeling of revenge and retribution and let's do the right thing here and let's get justice? Absolutely. But this is not that. In fact, this is the opposite of that. You're just attacking innocent people and assuming they're guilty. No, that's also something that is wrong and unjust and not right. So, again, we have to be intelligent and rational in our response here, and we have to be better than this. Okay, this is a moral failing. Now, this doesn't mean that any criticism of the doctrine of Islam or any criticism of Muslims, you immediately say, that's Islamophobic, and you shut down conversation, because that's also stupid. But should we call out anti-Muslim bigotry when there is real anti-Muslim bigotry? Yes. Is this an example of it? Or multiple examples of it? Absolutely. And anybody who says otherwise is a fucking idiot. So, again, let's get the people who did it. Let's go after ISIS, but to lump in innocent people as if they're guilty, well, they're not the problem. You become part of the problem.